Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, Congresswoman Donna Edwards returns to talk about oil, immigration, Afghanistan, and Obama. Punishing young people as adults. Liz Ryan of the Campaign for Youth Justice wants to know why we are abandoning the juvenile justice system. 35 years after the U.S. pulled out of Vietnam, award-winning author Wayne Carlin joins us to discuss his nonfiction reflection on the parallel stories of two warriors, forgiveness and reconciliation. We've got harmonies and ukuleles with the Sweater Set, and poetry by Rose Solari and Ray Berroa.
Where the powerful hide their divine dolarillos in the air of Guernicas and Bagdads, Treblincas, Hiroshimas, Nagasakis, where empires step upon and threaten the olive tree and the deer, the children, the flower.
On the Coffee House. Welcome to the forum at the Coffee House. The political noise in the country may be dominated by the Foxist echo chamber, Sarah Palin, Glenn Beck, and the Tea Party. But the last time the American people went to the polls in a regular election, they voted decisively for a Democratic president and Congress. Some pollsters and pundits prophesize that this November will be very different, that voters angered by Obamacare, illegal immigrants, and tax and spend Democrats will toss the rascals out. But one seat the GOP won't squander real dollars campaigning for is held by our guest, Representative Donna Edwards of Maryland. Completing her first full term, Representative Edwards has been a vocal leader on a range of cutting-edge issues, even as she minds constituent concerns in her district. Welcome, Representative Edwards, back to the Coffee House.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Thank you. Well, let's start with how President Obama is doing. Some people on the right, like Newt Gingrich, have said that he is the most radical president in history. Other people on the left say that he is too accommodating to his political foes. What do you think?
Well, this probably tells us that he's struck exactly the right balance as president. I think the president has done fantastically to take us from a financial crisis, an economic recession, and starting to lead us onto a path of economic growth, and then accomplishing what decades of presidents haven't been able to do: sign a health care law into law.
And that health care law, you were on the show last October, I think, and at the time we spent quite a bit of time speaking about the importance of the inclusion of a public option in that bill. Didn't get in. Some people say that it was important for the bill to pass less because of its impact on improving health care than on securing the viability of the Obama administration. What's your thinking?
Well, those things are hand in hand, and I actually think it is a tremendous bill for the American people, new law for the American people, when I think that people like me will be able to keep our young people, my son, on my health care plan until he's 26 years old. This is transformative for the American people. Small businesses that up until now haven't really been able to provide their employees with affordable health care will now get, a tax credit to be able to do that. In the 4th Congressional District, that's something like 13,000 small businesses. 8 new community health centers for the 4th Congressional District alone. And so I do believe it's transformative. And I was actually able to get a provision into the new law which deals with some of the issues I was concerned about with the public option, and that is providing some transparency and accountability for premium increases by insurance companies. And so now our state insurance commissioners across the country will have a chance to review published health insurance premium increases and then tell them they can't compete for new customers if they raise their rates excessively. And so this is a good win for the American public.
In January, the Supreme Court ruled, the majority of the Supreme Court ruled in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, effectively that corporations are people for purposes of the First Amendment, and that they can put as much money as they want into independent advertising around political campaigns. People said this is going to open the floodgates of corporate money into politics. Cynics might say that they've already been opened. But what do you think?
Well, not in this way. I think the Supreme Court upended decades of constitutional law that regulated corporate expenditures, and today, as of January 21st, a corporation can reach into their treasury and spend for or against any candidate for election. And so I look at that and say, if somebody like me is really outspoken against health insurers, which I was during the healthcare reform debate, then will that potentially chill my speech as a legislator? Because I know that the health insurance industry will be able to reach into their corporate treasuries and spend on campaigns. And so I've actually introduced a constitutional amendment, House Resolution 74, that would allow Congress the authority to regulate the expenditures of corporations. I've also signed on to legislation that I think we're trying to move forward that would provide for additional disclosure about what these expenditures are. And I think we have to work on parallel tracks here, because what the court has done, I think, has really changed the context of our elections, and I think it's dangerous.
And so the legislation that Representative Van Hall and Representative Castle have introduced is different than what you've introduced, which is a constitutional amendment, and it's more limited. A lot of people say about constitutional amendments, you don't want to open up that avenue, because once you do that, you go down that road, that you're going to hear all sorts of other constitutional amendments being advocated that you're not going to like, and they probably have a better chance of being enacted.
Well, what they're talking about, though, would be a process that would be a constitutional convention. That's not what a constitutional amendment is. And so I proposed this amendment. We already have 24 co-sponsors. We still have a tough hurdle here, but I think that these things have to proceed on parallel tracks. A constitutional amendment that gives Congress that authority move through the legislature. It's quite a hurdle, 2/3 of the Congress and then the state legislature. It can take up 7 years to do, but at the same time, we actually may face a situation where any legislation that we put forward is going to come under constitutional attack and be in the courts. So I think we have to proceed on parallel tracks, and these things are not inconsistent with each other. Just suffice it to say, it's really important that however we get there, we have to restore some order into the campaign finance system. I'd also like to see us pass a public financing of elections. I think it's high time, and this is exactly the reason. People's voices need to be heard in the process, and not just corporations.
The governor of Arizona just signed into law a measure that empowers the police to arrest people they have a reasonable suspicion are undocumented aliens. A lot of people, especially in the Latino community, believe that this is an invitation to racial profiling and is unconstitutional.
Well, it's not just an invitation. I actually listened a couple of times to the press conference that Governor Brewer gave on signing the legislation in Arizona. I've also listened to the commentary from some of the law enforcement officers and Attorney General in Arizona, and it's really troubling. And I think that states shouldn't be deciding our immigration law. It's up to the Congress to do that. I think it's going to require the leadership of the President to articulate to the American people the importance of both protecting our borders, but also having a comprehensive immigration policy that enables people, I believe, to move on a pathway toward citizenship, meet their responsibilities as new citizens, and also not jump in line ahead of others who've been waiting in line. And I believe that we can do those things, but it's going to require presidential leadership to get us there.
And do you think we can get there in an election year?
I'm not sure. I mean, when you look at the history, though, I think we've passed 4 major immigration bills during election years, and so it's not as though we haven't done that before. And so we could do it now. And the question, I think, right now is whether the Senate will be prepared to act. I think it's time for the Senate to act first on something, especially as serious as immigration reform. But when I think about our communities, I just look at the 4th Congressional District, and I've had a chance even just over the weekend to spend time with our South Asian community, with our Pakistani community, with our African diaspora immigrant community, all across our congressional district. And this is really about our diversity as a congressional district, our diversity as a country, and how we're going to embrace that in a way that ensures that we know who's crossing our borders, where they're crossing, and that people are here in a documented status so that it can raise the wage base of all workers here in the United States.
Virtually no sooner than President Obama announced a reversal in his position opposing offshore oil drilling, he said that it's now a part of his mix of approaches for achieving an energy independent future. Then we have the huge oil spill off the Louisiana coast. The administration is saying no more new drilling, at least until we find out the cause of this. Is that sufficient?
Well, I don't think it is. I don't support the president's proposal actually for offshore drilling. He actually made the announcement in the 4th Congressional District. But I think that we have a lot of investments actually that can be made in other kinds of energy technologies for the future. And as we've seen now demonstrated in the Gulf, this is wreaking havoc in our fishing industry with our estuary in the Gulf, and will wreak havoc on the economy, from tourism to other parts of the economy throughout those Gulf region states and across this country. And I think it demonstrates the problem of these deep water wells offshore and our inability to hold off a leak. And now we have actually 3 leaks, not just 1 leak. And as you know, from estimates from 5,000 to as much as 25,000 barrels pouring out of those leaks with no end in sight.
Wall Street. The House has passed legislation, the Senate is considering legislation. We're talking about this at a time when something is happening in Congress, but it's in flux. The bills are fairly similar, except there are some significant provisions that may not exist in the Senate side that exist in the House. One that strikes me in particular is what you might call the too big to fail provision that has been included in a House bill, which would essentially call for the dismantling of major financial institutions, if I understand it. If they fail and they're too big, it would be a gradual dismantling of them so that there isn't, it doesn't add to the crisis. There's a bill like that in the Senate, but it hasn't been included in the main bill. How important is that?
I think it's important. I'll see whether we can get from here to there in the Senate. I mean, my concern is that taxpayers not be put at risk again, the way that taxpayers were put at risk when the financial industry sector crashed. And so I think it's important to have consumer protection so we can make sure that these products that probably never should have been on the market get on there again. We have to really look at this derivatives trade to make sure that it's actually an area that's regulated under law and doesn't fall outside of the sweep of federal jurisdiction. And there's no reason that the traditional banking sector has always sort of paid for that kind of risk that we can't do it here. And so I'll be looking forward to see what the Senate produces and whether we maybe even be able to strengthen it. And a consumer protection agency. I think we have to have that. I mean, consumers cannot be put in a situation of having to bear the kind of risk that we did with this. And I think consumers actually expect that.
Afghanistan. The president indicated that he was on a timetable for withdrawal even as he escalated in Afghanistan. Is it your sense at this point that we're on our way out or digging ourselves into a bigger hole?
Well, I've been reading some of the literature these last days across the political spectrum. Even people who actually agree with the president's direction and strategy wonder whether it has the capacity to succeed. And I wonder about that as well, and whether this expenditure of 90% of our resources into defense and security, imbalanced with only 10% roughly going to the kind of development, economic development, and human needs that some argue is really necessary for Afghanistan to crawl its way out of the 16th century into the 21st century. And a government that has, central government anyway, model that hasn't functioned at all. I mean, Afghanistan has actually never operated under a central government that functioned, and there's no reason to believe that that will be true in the future. And so if we're going to figure out a governance structure, it may not be the one that at least the Bush administration tried from the early days to impose on Afghanistan, and to date hasn't worked.
I'm going to ask you to put on a different political hat for a second and think of yourself as a member of the opposite party. A person from your own district, Michael Steele, who's the chair of the Republican National Committee, has come under a lot of fire for financial scandals, sex scandals while he was in charge of the Republican National Committee. There's a sense that he's too hot to remove because it's largely an all-white party. He's the most significant African-American figure in the head of the party. And some people are saying that, well, Stephen Colbert used the phrase, it's affirmative inaction that allows him to stay in that position. I'm wondering what your take on that is.
Well, I don't know about that, and I have to tell you, I can't get up in the morning and picture myself as a member of the opposite party. And so let me just say that I think that, you know, the Republicans have a lot to answer to the American people for about how it moves and develops its party, and whether it's a party that's just playing to a very narrow segment of the society, whether it's represented by Michael Steele or not. I happen to believe that the Democratic Party actually shares the value and vision of most of the American public, and I'm looking forward to both, you know, changing some of those red states to blue districts in my role as vice chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, but also making sure that we have a solid majority so that we can continue to do good work with the President of the United States, and we'll let those Republicans scramble around and, you know, sort of feed on their young.
Well, many thanks to Representative Donna Edwards for taking time out of your monster schedule to share a little coffee with us. November isn't so far off. If Donna Edwards and her soulmates can drive the Democratic Party toward policies that really stand up for middle income and poor Americans, health care, green jobs, Wall Street accountability, I predict that a Democratic majority will remain intact after the midterm elections. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Coffee House Forum.
Because of their size and the shape of their ears, and the sweetness and wisdom she claimed to see in their miraculously lashed eyes, my mother, for as long as I can remember, loved elephants. At the zoo, she would linger chuckling before their house, the babies in particular seeming to hold some charm for her, their wrinkled legs belying their years. Someone in cruelty had called her an elephant once when she was a girl because of her size, which she could not control, despite a diet of not much more than cigarettes and overperked coffee. Perhaps her fondness for those creatures started then, a way of turning the pain around, as after her death I would tell my friends that it was easier to love my mother now that she'd lost the burden of her body. When she began to collect them, china, brass, and seashell, carved into the tops of wooden or pewter boxes, blown out of glass, it was a relief to all of us, I think, to have something to give this woman who almost no gift could please. Now she had found one small, true thing that could never fail her. Regardless of value, she adored them all, arrayed them across the piano, her dresser, the windowsills, as if like guard dogs they marked the perimeters of her turf. She hardly went out at all by then. The cough that embarrassed her children, rising as it would at all the worst moments, kept her at home. And then the oxygen, of course, those last years of hers attached to a metal tank. Long after the dusting and polishing had become an impossible chore, we still brought them to her like flowers, like a language without anger that we had found at last to speak. The weekend after my mother's funeral, I drove to the beach, thinking I might uncover at the meeting of sand and water better words than the priest who mispronounced her name had used to say goodbye. It was May and raining. Though each morning of those 3 days I put on my bathing suit and wore it beneath my clothes, as if desire alone could change the weather. On the last night, with no answers yet to whisper into the emptiness you feel when your best enemy has fallen to infinite silence, I went for one more walk on shore and threw into the waves the last present I'd given my mother, a small silver elephant, its trunk raised up like a greeting, like a promise of something better, not only rest and peace, but please, I prayed some happiness for that woman whose heart, so bruised by time and sorrow, might yet, in another life, be healed by joy.
Welcome to Courting Justice at the Coffee House. Over 100 years ago, the American justice system established special juvenile courts for children under the age of 18 charged with breaking the law. However, during the 1990s, almost every state passed laws making it easier to charge, try, and incarcerate juveniles in the adult criminal justice system. What caused this shift in policy, and have there been unintended consequences? Joining me today is Liz Ryan, a longtime juvenile justice advocate and a leader of the movement to end the practice of charging juveniles as adults. Welcome, Liz, to the Coffee House.
Thank you.
Your organization, the Campaign for Youth Justice, has pretty much devotes itself to ending this practice of trying juveniles as adults and charging them. And I want to talk to you about your work. But first, can we talk about why is it that children are charged as adults in the first place? Under what circumstances are they charged as adults in the criminal justice system?
Well, almost every state has a way in which kids can be tried in adult court. The most common way used to be that a juvenile court judge would see that young person and decide whether that young person was beyond rehabilitation. That happened in very rare instances, in very extreme cases. Very few kids under those circumstances were sent to adult court. But in the 1990s, as you said, many states changed their laws to make it easier to try kids as adults. And so a couple additional ways were added. One is that prosecutors in about 15 states have the authority to send kids to adult court. And in about 30 states, there are laws on the books that say if you're a young person at a certain age, charged with a certain offense, you automatically go to adult court.
And I want to talk more about that in a bit, but I still want to talk about this basic phenomenon. Is the idea, or was the idea, that there are certain types of crimes that if you committed those crimes, that meant that you just couldn't be tried as a juvenile because you couldn't be rehabilitated? Or was it more, was the idea anyway, more focused on individual juveniles, where they'll say this particular kid, regardless of what he or she's charged with, just something about this child makes him or her, not amenable to rehabilitative treatment? Which was it, or was it a bit of both, do you think?
I think it was a bit of both. There was an hysteria over youth crime in the 1990s. There was a high-profile case in 1989 in New York City, the Central Park jogger case, where 5 young people were charged and sentenced as adults for a crime against a young woman who was running through the park. Of course, those young people were exonerated many years later, but that individual case created a wave in the media. The media made sure that case was on the front page of every newspaper in New York City, and so states around the country, in anticipation of cases like that, decided to change their laws. And so 47 states made it easier to try kids as adults. And what we're seeing now, of course, is that those laws are being overused, that many, many more people are going through adult criminal court, many more than were intended, we think, by the original change in those laws.
So I wanted to talk about that. Why in the 1990s? I mean, was it just the Central Park jogger case? I mean, was there something going on around the country where, the criminal laws were getting tougher and the juvenile justice laws were getting tougher? Was there some phenomenon going on that sort of made all these states start moving in that direction? Or, I mean, because it seems like we've had juvenile court for quite a long time, and then all of a sudden there's this big push to charge juveniles as adults.
I think it was a variety of factors. One was juvenile crime was increasing just a little bit around the country, so a number of criminologists actually predicted a wave of juvenile crime. Of course, the wave of juvenile crime never materialized, but there was a little bit of an uptick in juvenile crime. I think also there was a feeling among a number of experts around the country that some young people were beyond rehabilitation, that the laws needed to be tougher, that young people needed more accountability, that the juvenile justice system was too soft on kids. It didn't provide enough of the sort of tough on crime kind of response. And of course, we're seeing the results of that.
So you mentioned before that there are a number of different ways that children can be charged as adults. You mentioned prosecutors, you mentioned laws. I mean, what's the most predominant way that it happens? Is most of the power in the hands of the prosecutor to decide which cases, which children are going to be charged as adults? Are there some laws that mandate that if a kid is alleged to have committed a certain crime that they have to be charged as an adult? And are judges do they have some control over that, or is it sort of a mixture of all of those things?
It's a mixture of all of those things. In almost every state, a judge can make a decision about whether or not to send a young person to adult criminal court. But actually, juvenile court judges send very few kids to adult criminal court. Kids end up in adult court by two other ways primarily, and I think prosecutors are the main decision maker in both of those situations. In one situation, in about 15 states, prosecutors have sole discretion. So the prosecutor can say, this young person must be tried in adult court, and they can send that young person to adult court. That young person's never seen by a juvenile court judge. They don't have a hearing, and they can be awaiting trial in an adult jail pre-trial. So they bypass the juvenile justice system. Another way is called automatic exclusion, and those kinds of laws basically say if you're 14, 15, 16, or 17, if you're charged with a certain type of offense, then you automatically go to adult court. And what we're finding is that in many of those circumstances, prosecutors are overcharging children. Those young people end up getting sent back to the juvenile justice system in large numbers, or they get convicted of offenses for which they never would have been in adult criminal court. So we think that there's some overcharging going on there with prosecutors, and that those kinds of laws really need to be re-examined.
So I think most people, when they think of juveniles being charged as adults, they think these are the kids who are charged with murder. These are serious assaults, and I assume that happens in those cases. But are there also cases of juveniles being charged with crimes that are not so serious, where they're still being charged as adults?
Yes, we actually think that most cases of kids in the adult criminal court are non-violent offenses. That there are a lot of cases for which kids are tried in adult criminal court because in their state they say that all 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds or all 17-year-olds are automatically in adult court, or they're charged with something like robbery, and there's a lot of gray area on what a robbery is considered to be. And so there is not the ability to have that case reviewed in juvenile court. And we think that if juvenile court judges could look at those cases, a lot less kids would end up in adult court.
Let me talk to you about race and class issues, because we know in the criminal justice system, the adult criminal justice system, there are tremendous disparities, racial and class disparities. Are those kind of disparities, we know they also exist in the juvenile system, but with this decision of charging juveniles as adults, are there disparities there as well?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, we see that as the most disparate point in the juvenile justice system. That decision about whether or not a young person ends up in adult criminal court primarily impacts young people of color. We're seeing large numbers of African American, Latino, Native American kids ending up in adult criminal court, many of them spending time pretrial in adult jails, many of them sentenced terms in adult prisons. The most harsh and punitive aspect of the juvenile justice system, which is the transfer decision, falls on young people of color.
And we only have a few minutes left, and I want to talk about why you do this work. What are some of the harms really from this? A lot of people would say, well, you know, this is happening, but what's the problem? What is the problem with this whole system?
There are two really big problems. One is that it harms young people. Those young people are put in adult correctional facilities, pretrial or post-conviction. It's very harmful to those young people. It also harms that young person in terms of their ability to get a job or to go to school. There are lifelong consequences there. It also does not increase public safety. And we know now from the U.S. Department of Justice, the Federal Centers for Disease Control, the Brookings Institution, other researchers around the country have demonstrated time and time again that trying young people in the adult criminal court actually increases the likelihood those young people will reoffend.
And I imagine some of the things that might happen to juveniles in adult courts must be pretty horrible as well.
Yes,
in adult jails, I should say.
That's correct. Young people in adult jails or adult prisons are most at risk of sexual assault, suicide, and other consequences.
Well, let's talk about whether there's been progress made. I mean, do you think that there's some movement in terms of states perhaps pulling back on some of these laws? Are you seeing any progress along those lines?
We are seeing progress. About a quarter of the states in the past 5 years have changed laws to reduce the prosecution of youth in adult court and to reduce the placement of young people in jails and prisons. This is very good news, and we hope that trend continues.
Can you give me an example of, some of the states where that's happening?
So earlier this year, in January, Connecticut and Illinois implemented laws to reduce the prosecution of youth in adult criminal court. Virginia just passed a law to remove young people from adult jails, And Colorado and Mississippi have legislation under consideration as we speak to change how young people are treated by the justice system.
And so what is some of the work that you and your organization that you're doing at the Campaign for Youth Justice?
We work with people all over the country who are interested in this issue and want to take a stand. We're actually encouraging people to join the movement. We have these orange bands so that people can take a stand wherever they are in the country, and we encourage them to come to our website, campaignforyouthjustice.org, to get more information, to learn how they can take action in their own communities.
And can you just give an example of some of the things that you have people to do?
We're encouraging people to contact their state officials to urge re-examination of these laws. We're asking people to contact Congress to pass the Juvenile Justice Act, something that we think should be updated. And we're also encouraging people to start campaigns in their own states.
Campaigns like the one that you're doing, which would involve them doing what? Let's say an individual wanted to do that.
What they do is they tell their friends about the issue, get some information, pull together people in a meeting. I think encouraging people to contact the media to raise awareness about the issue and get others involved in their efforts.
Well, thank you, Liz Ryan, for sharing your insights with us today. For more information about juveniles in the adult criminal justice system, visit www.campaignforyouthjustice.org. My name is Angela Davis, and this has been Courting Justice.
The one who paints with umbrellas over his shoulder prepares his hearing for the praise that comes from within when he must create. He comes with schmuck, with doves, horseshoes, and a camera in his boldness, where he puts reality, its feet in the air, making it as dirty as he wants with his toes. From tracing it so many times on the canvas, he discovers that death is the root of beauty, and other music the life of color. Besides never entering those castles where the Academy hides its lion stench, the one who draws his sketches in tempera has no goddesses with generous breasts or shaved crotches, but instead hopes with brassieres, flags without skeletons, surprises with twisted pubes, mothers, nuns, and light bulbs with animal screams. He pissed on money and its harmony, but today he kisses it under his arm where he carries his own head and his power. The palette bleeds that which cries, destroys with the index finger the narrowness of movement, charges the eye with discovering what is ancient, and paints red hot the unpaid sweat of the workers, the kiss homosexual and without shame, the bleeding clitoris of so many Muslim females, the plagues of this AIDS-ernetic age, the excessive stinking sacks where the powerful hide their divine dolarillos, and the air of Guernicas and Bagdads, Treblincas, Hiroshimas, Nagasakis, where empires step upon and threaten the olive tree and the deer, the children, the flower.
41 years ago, First Lieutenant Homer Steedley, Jr. shot and killed North Vietnamese soldier Hong Ngoc Dam on a jungle trail. It was Homer's first kill. Homer recovered a journal and other mementos from Dam and sent them home to the U.S. for safekeeping. 35 years later, Homer found the journal and, tormented by his war memories, began a quest to return it to Dam's family. He was joined on this journey by our guest, ex-Marine and author Wayne Carlin, who recounts this remarkable story in Wandering Souls, Journeys with the Dead and Living in Vietnam. Wayne Carlin is a recipient of the Patterson Prize for Fiction and is a literature professor at the College of Southern Maryland. Welcome to the Coffee House.
Thank you.
Why don't we begin by talking about that fateful meeting between Homer and Dam. Tell me what happened.
Homer was a first lieutenant, a platoon leader. He was in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. Excuse me, and he had led a patrol up a mountainside to a ridgeline checking out a trail. At the end of the patrol, they were taking a break, and he checked around another bend and saw a North Vietnamese soldier coming around, strolling. He had not expected Americans to be there, with his weapon slung over his shoulder. Homer had his rifle down at the waist at the ready, so he yelled at him to surrender, and the North Vietnamese soldier tried to bring his weapon down, and Homer stitched him across the chest with 3 rounds, and then went over to the body and literally saw the light going out of his eyes before he died, and took these documents and notebooks from the body.
Well, tell me a little bit about each of them growing up. Who were they?
In doing this book, it was one of the things that struck me. Both of them came from very similar backgrounds. They were both farm kids. Hoang Nhat Dam, who was the North Vietnamese soldier and a medic, grew up in a small village in the north. He, when he was a kid, he plowed rice paddies behind water buffaloes and so on. And Homer grew up as a farm kid in South Carolina, rural South Carolina. Literally worked with a mule, plowing behind a mule. Came from a very poor family. One other commonality between both families is they both have a tradition, a military tradition, of sending their kids to whatever wars their countries are involved in. So with Dom's family, his father had fought against the French and so on down the line, and Homer's dad had been a World War II veteran. And when I went down to Bamberg, South Carolina, I saw in the graveyard there, a Captain Steedley who had been in the Civil War and so on.
And Homer grew up with a strong sense of social justice, though, didn't he?
He did, and he owes a lot of that to his father, who hadn't finished high school, had gone to the war very early and so on, but he seems to have been a man without being stained with the racial prejudices of that day and that place. And partially that was because of their poverty. I mean, Homer grew up working with African Americans. Homer and his father eventually formed a partnership with another African American that raised the family out of poverty because he had a way of curing tobacco, which apparently was very marketable. And as a result of that, they had the Ku Klux Klan burning a cross on their neighbor's lawn, and Homer remembers his father coming out with a shotgun and chasing them away. So he grew up with that, and when he went to university, he by accident came across...
This was at Clemson.
In Clemson, yeah. He came across all of the transcripts of the Nuremberg trials, and he became fascinated by that. He was a science major, but he spent hours and hours reading that and making that connection with his father and in a sense with his mother, who was a German war bride. And he took that strong sense of justice and morality with him to Vietnam, and that in certain situations that stood him very well.
So let's fast forward. How did Homer, he had sent back this journal, these documents, what led him to rediscover them 35 years after?
He had a bad war. There's very little good wars for combat veterans. He was haunted by many memories. He spent a lot of time after the war trying to deal with that, not finding people to speak to, trying to handle it by drinking, by adrenaline sports, and so on. It wasn't until he was married, and his wife was also the daughter of a soldier, and was very sympathetic, that she urged him to start looking into that. And he had put the diary and the journals out of his mind, but his mother reminded him that she had a box of these things in the attic in South Carolina, and he went and rediscovered the journals. And when he saw them, it all came back to him. And he wanted at that point to try to find the family, to create some kind of ending to this.
So who was Nhat? What did he find in those journals that resonated
It's amazing.
with him?
He was a medic, and what he had done in the main journal.
This is Dom, I'm sorry.
This is Dom, yeah.
Yeah.
Was to basically copy a medical textbook with exquisite drawings and notes and so on. Then remember, he's doing this in the jungle, and he's doing this in the middle. This is some of the heaviest combat of the war, and he has these pages of his own little decorative drawings also. Draw some flowers and some orchids and surgical scissors and so on. And it was just one of the things that struck Homer was the meticulousness, the care of doing that, and the way he had bound the notebook and kept it preserved in the jungle. And it was seeing that was the shock of seeing, here's this human being that I killed, and that has done all of this. The enemy was always faceless for most of us, and it had been for Homer also. I mean, he'd seen bodies before, he'd been in firefights, but to have the shock of that humanity was what caused that connection and that grief.
And so tell me about how he set out to return all of this.
He had asked a number of people, including a guy named Tom Lacombe, who had been in that area also, and Tom knew me, and I, over the years since about '93, I've been connected with people in Vietnam. We've done some projects of writers in Vietnam, and some books of theirs that we've translated and brought here. So he knew that I had those connections, and he asked, would it be possible to find a family? And I was really struck by this. I mean, it just seemed like such a, we never had an ending. There's never any neat endings with the war, and this seemed like a really powerful thing to do. So I contacted journalists I knew in Vietnam. Homer had scanned all the documents, and they ran an article in a couple of newspapers in Vietnam with the scanned documents in the story. And within a week, the Dom's family had seen that, and were completely.
Why does it matter so much in Vietnamese culture to have these documents returned?
I think it matters in any culture in a sense to have something of the dead, of the deceased. But for one thing, out of the war, there were 300,000 missing in Vietnam. And the same as Dom, families never knew what happened to them. They knew they died, but they never got the body. They never had any part of it. Out of Dom's village, there was 142 like that, including his younger brother. In Vietnamese culture, particularly in village tradition, something, if not the remains themselves, and something that belonged to that person needs to come back to the village and be commemorated on the altar of the ancestors. And they really literally see it as a part of the soul that comes back. And when a person's born in Vietnam, their umbilical cord is buried in the soil of the village. There's that kind of attachment. And it's the same with the dead. There's a woman who had helped us with this in Vietnam whose job is to do this, and she said, I'll never forget her words, that each object glistens with the soul of the person that it belonged to.
So tell me what happened when you went back to the village.
Well, there was two stages to this. I mean, at first, when the family got in touch with us, they asked Homer to come back. And they said they had no bitterness. They understood he was a soldier. They were grateful that he kept the documents so that they could have this return and find out what happened. But he said he just couldn't do it at that time, and he asked me to take it back. And I was going anyway, so I took it back to the village. And I thought it would be a private ceremony with the family. We went out to the village. Everybody, I mean, hundreds of people were lining the streets, and they were wearing these white mourning headbands that you wear in a funeral, and people were crying as if he had died the week before, because he really represented all the missing from that village.
I'm going to ask you to read a passage about Dom's funeral because we're running short on time, but I want to make sure that we have a chance to do this. It's very moving. And this is, I think you know what I'm referring to. Why don't you go ahead and do that?
Okay. Well, this was the second trip. After we brought the documents back, Homer did go back, and we managed to find the remains with the family in Pleiku in the Central Highlands and bring them back to the village. So there was literally a funeral. And I'll just set it up in this way. One of the things that really struck me in the funeral is they asked Homer to be one of the casket bearers, and the other casket bearers were all of these, they were soldiers, and they were wearing what Dom would have worn. I mean, they were really present-day soldiers, but they're wearing the pith helmets and so on. And there's this picture of this American who had killed this man, bearing the weight of his body and doing it with these other people. And I'll just read this passage. When we came out to the gravesite, we kneel at the graveside, and again I shield Wang's match as he lights more incense. He hands the joss sticks to us, and we bury their ends in the ground in front of the altar, the earth resisting and then parting for them. A moment later, Luang hands Homer and me chunks of the earth to throw into the grave. Homer's fingers work the ball of dirt, crumbling it, giving it back, and later he says to me that it is the feel of that earth in his hands, Dom's earth, that he will always take with him on his skin, replacing the red Pleiku mud of the war. I say my own farewell to Dom, a final one now, and think of the grace notes of this day, the grace and courage of a soldier who brought back the body and the soul of the man he had killed to that man's family and town and earth, taking onto himself their own rending grief, the grace and mercy of a family and a village that take that soldier to their hearts, that allow their gratitude at the ending he brings their story to outweigh their need to hate him for the death that began it.
Well, many thanks to Wandering Souls author Wayne Carlin for joining us to discuss his moving account of war, trauma, and reconciliation. As Chris Hedges observes, this book strips away the heroic mythology used to mask the depravity and anguish of war. As importantly, it connects the common humanity of idealistic youth who eagerly go to battle for their leaders' geopolitical ends that are quickly lost in history. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Writer's Block.
I've read your letter so many times today. I've read your letter so many times today. I know I should probably just put it away. I've listened to that message you left for me 1 or 2 times, or maybe even 3. I just can't seem to stop it or delete. And I know this might take longer, and I know I should be smarter, but I can't turn back now. So if you don't mind, I'll stick around. True, I barely know you, you don't know me. You might have lots of secrets I haven't seen, but hanging out with you's been so easy. And would it be alright if I kissed you tonight? And would it be okay or too forward if I asked you to stay? I'll help you with that baggage I see you're carrying. And I know this might take longer, and I know I should be smarter, but I can't turn back now. So if you don't mind, I'll stick around. And I know this might take longer, and I know I should be smarter, but I can't turn back now. So if you don't mind, I'll stick around, stick around, stick around.
Welcome, welcome to the sweater set. Greetings. I'll stick around, as the song said.
Oh,
Thanks,
thank you, David.
That's good. Otherwise, it would be a very quick interview if I wasn't here. This is the current recording,
Surprise visit.
surprise visit, and again, you're holding a kazoo in your mouth. I don't know if they can catch that on the photo.
We play a lot of kazoo.
It's true.
We do.
And,
We have them.
So again, what would you say the vibe of the sweater set is?
Well, you know, we were discussing this earlier. We have so much fun playing music together. It's really like our friendship and our relationship. We grew up doing music together in church, and when we produce the songs together, we write them separately, and then we write parts for them together. And it's really fun, and we have a blast together. We have fun. So our music is just supposed to be fun.
And so when you hear us play, it's sort of like hearing how we interact as friends, too.
Yeah.
So in that last song, for example, there's a line of, I'll help carry your baggage for you. Now that could be taken on many levels.
Yeah.
And that's subtle. I mean, probably the first time I heard that, I didn't quite catch it, but then I thought about it tonight, and I was like,
We love
Thank
lyrics.
you. We love lyrics.
And I think that's a big part of your vibe, that if people, again, if they're not paying attention, it's going right over their heads. And if they pay attention, there's some really good stuff.
That's the kind of music we like, the kind of music you can listen to over and over again and get new things from it each time. It's the best.
Yeah, it's really good stuff. I think of like girl groups that I liked, or still like the Roaches, Maggie,
Right.
Terry, and Suzy. I catch that right away. Quirky stuff. The Chenille sisters, and then maybe even going further back to the Boswell sisters. So, and it's interesting that even though you're not sisters, it sounds like you're sisters.
Well, we
which is
learned how
cool.
to sing together, so that's...
Yeah, Sarah's mom was our choir director.
Ah, little known facts about the sweater
Exactly.
set.
So maybe we were treated like sisters, too.
Probably, yeah. Okay, well, what are you going to take us out with? Take us out with one more.
We're going to take you out with a reggae-style song.
Of course.
It's, of course,
Yeah.
on the ukulele,
Yes.
called One Day I'll Hide Your Keys.
Great.
Don't you wonder what I do when I shrink to nothing behind you and your truck? Open road always hits me in the gut. Oh, I see you leave, wipe my nose on my shirt sleeve. Birds keep singing while I grieve. One day I'll hide your keys. what I do when I shrink to nothing behind you and your truck. Open road always hits, 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 always hits me in the gut. Oh, I see you leave, wipe my nose on my shirt sleeve. Those birds keep singing while I grieve. One day I'll hide your keys.